September 1945, World War II came to an end. Some of the most iconic visuals were crowds of people celebrating, ticker tape parades, and a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square. Freedom and democracy had been preserved, and it would be the advent of a new day for everyone who made it possible. Or would it? The African American experience for the World War II veterans was a much different experience. So we're going to talk about that, and staying in line with the theme of coming home, we're going to look at coming home, the African American experience. And we're going to look at African Americans defending the nation prior to World War II, African American experience during World War II. We will mention some of the black units that served. We'll also look at the GI Bill, what it was intended to do and how it actually played out for African American veterans. And then we will look at the legacy of African Americans in World War II. But we have to build a foundation of African Americans defending the country. African Americans have defended the country since the Revolutionary War. When General Washington became general over the Continental Armies, he made it clear that he did not want the very old, he did not want the very young, and he did not want blacks to fight. Interestingly, the Second Amendment gives citizens the right to bear arms, but even before then, there were ordinances against blacks arming themselves, before the amendment and even after. And maybe there, particularly during the Revolutionary War, that there was a fear that, black folk may turn those guns against the wrong people. And that would have been a legitimate concern. If you have not been kind to an individual, you may get the fear, or there may be a fear that if that person gets guns in their hands, they may not be very kind to you. So that was certainly a legitimate concern. Defending the country and full citizenship go hand in hand. And if an individual is willing to lay their life down for the country, you cannot deny them full citizenship. Now, both sides, the Americans and the British, promised freedom. So if you are enslaved and you want to be free, does it make a difference who provides it? So there was an issue, and first George Washington was like, no, and then Lord Dunmore makes his proclamation and says, hey, we'll give freedom to anybody who wants to defend Her Majesty's crown. And then George Washington had to rethink his position. Alexander Hamilton said that if you want to secure black fidelity, you have to give them a musket and give them their freedom. Marquis de Lafayette, who fought on behalf of the Continental Army and the United States, or soon to be United States, said after the war, he said he would have never drawn his sword in defense of the United States had he known it would have become a nation of slaves. That was Marquis de Lafayette. So blacks have been participating in defense of the country since the very beginning. Blacks participated in the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. Well, that's when the war took place. Now, there was the Confiscation Acts of 61 and 62, and it did talk about having blacks working at the Union, but didn't really say how. It wasn't until Mr. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that it made it legal. That was January 1st, 1863. And mind you that, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single individual. We can go into that at a different time. But what it did do was authorize blacks to fight. What Mr. Lincoln wrote essentially said, any man of African descent who wants to fight for the Union Army or the Union Navy will be allowed to do so. Over 209,000 men of color took that musket up and put on that uniform. 38,000 of them died in the process. As a result of blacks' performance during the American Civil War, they authorized blacks in the U.S. military. It was on a segregated basis, but after the war, they were authorized, and it started out with 6 units, and eventually it was trimmed down to 4 units: the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments and the 9th and 10th Cavalry. Both of those latter two would be known as Buffalo Soldiers. And so black folks understood there were 4 things that had to happen if they were going to be successful, and they realized this shortly after the Civil War. They had to be able to educate themselves, they had to be able to own property, they had to have the right to vote, and they had to be able to negotiate their own work contract. Now, those 4 things are connected with prosperity and generational wealth, and you're going to see those themes recurring throughout this entire presentation. I'm not going to mention it every time, but you will see it. Spanish-American War in 1898 was the first time that Americans fought together since the American Civil War. Interestingly, a lot of blacks made the military a career. It was better than some of the other alternatives that they could have done. And some of the most seasoned units were black troops. Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were in a tough situation during that war, and they were almost annihilated. And Theodore Roosevelt even said it was because of black troops that helped them out, that essentially saved them. But of course, Mr. Roosevelt pursued politics, and over time he told that story less. In 1906, there was the Brownsville affair. This was relating to the 25th Infantry Regiment. There was racial incidents between blacks and whites, and a lot of those guys were arrested and eventually discharged without honor. I'll put it that way. And then later on, years later, they reinvestigated and found out that those guys did not do what they were accused of doing. But of course, at that point, they had lost their pensions, and some of those guys were close to retirement at the time of the incident. So in World War I, 1917-18, just the years leading up to World War I, remember 1915, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation came out, and it was also the time of the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. This was in 1915. So now as we approached World War I, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American to receive a PhD in history from Harvard, said this. He says, "Let us, while the war lasts, forget our special grievances and close ranks shoulder to shoulder with our white fellow citizens, fighting for democracy, while we make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly." And so that's Dr. Du Bois. And so he's encouraging black men to, put this fight for civil rights on the back burner, and let's come together with, the rest of the country and fight for the country. And I guess he thought that when it was all over, things would be different. There were 2 infantry divisions that went overseas that were segregated, the 92nd and the 93rd. The 92nd fought under the American flag. The 93rd flew under the French flag. Now, the reason why that is significant is because the 93rd, which fought under the French flag, got quite a few awards for their heroism and for their exploits, and some of them were awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is France's highest military medal, while the 92nd, there were a lot of negative reports about the 92nd, and there are a lot of details that I'm leaving out about that. Normally the individuals who had something good to say about the 92nd were those commanding officers who were actually in the field with those guys. But, as I said, they flew under the U.S. flag, and so they did not get much recognition. During 1970, the Camp Logan Mutiny, this was the 24th Infantry was involved in that. The police were being a bit brutal to some of the black residents in some of the black areas of the town, and one of the soldiers got arrested and beat up. And so the soldier said, we're not taking this anymore. We're going in and do something about it. And of course they did. They had their retaliation. And in the final analysis, 19 African American soldiers were hanged and 45 were imprisoned. After the war, Dr. Du Bois said, "We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why." That was, once again, Dr. Du Bois. And of course, during the summer of 1919, it's referred to sometimes as bloody summer, there were anti-black race riots that erupted in cities across the nation. 76 African Americans were lynched, 14 were burned at the stake, and 10 of those victims were soldiers, and some of them were still in uniform when they were killed. Now, something very significant happened in 1925. It was a 1925 report on the use of Negro manpower in wartime. Now, they ended up doing a study on some of the soldiers, and they happened to choose these soldiers from the 92nd Infantry Division, which I told you was fought under the U.S. flag, and most of them were, about 80% of them were from the South. And so you know that there is an education, or there was an education disparity in the South. So using them as the only group to do the study on was going to give you a certain set of data. And so in the final analysis, this is what the conclusions that they came to about black soldiers or Negro soldiers. They said that blacks are leaderless, they are non-patriotic, they have smaller brains, they're lazy and shiftless, they are afraid of the dark, they're superstitious, immoral, inferior to whites in every way. And because of this is the lens that the military, or that the Army, is looking at or looking through prior to World War II. And so the idea was, yeah, you can bring blacks into the military, but we'll either have to put them in labor battalions or make them stewards. You can trust them to move a box from point A to point B, but don't expect them to do anything much more than that. And so, as I said, that was the lens through which the Army was viewing blacks prior to World War II. So now let's look at the African American experience during World War II. Now, in the months prior to U.S. involvement, the Selective Service Act of 1940, let me say that there were some congressional members who were pushing for full integration in the military. But by the time this act gets to where it needs to, or is finally written, it essentially says that they will bring in, they will draft individuals who are acceptable, which, how do you define acceptable? And it also says, until adequate provision shall be made for shelters, sanitary facilities, medical care, and hospital accommodations. Well, what is that essentially doing? It's going to enforce segregation. Now, somebody could read that and say, well, that doesn't necessarily say that. It just says, okay, that's fine. Well, September 14th, this thing was signed. And the next day, blacks started volunteering in droves, and they were turned away because of too few segregated facilities. Mrs. Roosevelt encouraged the president to get blacks trained in military service because of the growing sentiment to let them fight. It was also an election year, and so people will do certain things during an election year, particularly if they're trying to get reelected. And one of the things that happened in 1940, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was commissioned as the first African American general of the United States Army. Was that a political move? You better believe it was. A. Philip Randolph, who we know for the March on Washington in 1943, was a part of the pre-war protests wanting to get equality in industry and in the military, and they had even threatened to march in 1941. President Roosevelt was like, you don't have to march for that. I can make that happen with the stroke of a pen. And so essentially he did that. And so there was no march in 1941. And there was a pledge to allow blacks into industry and the military. Over 2.5 million black men registered. Numerous women volunteered. Over 1 million served in the U.S. military during World War II. Now, because of race challenges in the States, the black press started what was called the Double V campaign. It was fighting Double V for victory, fighting fascism abroad and fighting racism at home. And so that would be coined, I think it was the Pittsburgh Courier that coined the Double V campaign. And let me just say that the black press would be very instrumental during the wartime. I mean, the press is always instrumental when they report stuff that that otherwise may not have been reported, but you'll see some instances of that. There were 15 messmen who joined the Navy, and they had actually written a letter. They joined the Navy on the promise of learning a trade, and they ended up writing the Pittsburgh Courier. And here's what they wrote. They said, "We sincerely hope to discourage any other colored boys who might have planned to join the Navy and make the same mistake we did. All they will become is seagoing bellhops, chambermaids, and dishwashers. We take it upon ourselves to write this letter regardless of any action the Navy authorities may take. We know it could not possibly surpass the mental cruelty inflicted upon us on the ship." These are Navy sailors, U.S. sailors, who were writing this letter. And they're talking about their experiences. November 1942, while stationed at Camp Polk, Louisiana, Private Merle Monroe wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier describing the black soldier's struggle to maintain a sense of patriotic pride in the face of lynching. Here's what he wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier. He says, "Morale to the Negro, as with every human being, is like yeast to bread. Morale puffs us up with love and pride for our country. It puffs us up with the will to fight, to resist any change by force to our way of life. Morale, in a broad sense, is knowledge and understanding of, and faith in the high principles our country must represent. The right to live our lives unhampered by strings of prejudice, the right to earn bread, a place in the sun for us and our posterity. And with these necessary stimulants, we Negro soldiers will resist with every inch of our stature any threat to our country's laws that must protect our rights during periods of tranquility." That was Private Merle Monroe writing to the Pittsburgh Courier in 1942. The 349th Aviation Squadron, based in Carlsbad, California. February 1943, Sergeant Henry Jones wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt explaining that Jim Crowism was being practiced on the base in recreation and transportation. There was a theater that seated 1,000, and there was a row. There were 20 seats on the back row that were reserved for black military. They could go into the post exchange to buy refreshments. They just could not eat them on the premises. And as it pertained to transportation, there was a half of a row in the back of a bus that was designated for coloreds, or Negroes, coloreds, African Americans, and so that's what they were writing Mrs. Roosevelt about. August 1944, the white owner of a small restaurant in Shreveport, Louisiana, shot and wounded 4 black soldiers. He claimed attempted to take over his place. He faced no charges. Black soldiers were having to sit behind German and Italian POWs for food and for USO shows. And also, Tuskegee Army nurse, Second Lieutenant Nora Green, was on the bus, and she was asked to give up her seat. She was not in, maybe she should have been in uniform, but she was not in uniform, so they made her get out of her seat. She was eventually arrested. But I will tell you that Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson, who would go on to become, the person who broke the color barrier in the major leagues, was in uniform when he was asked to give up his seat. And if you know anything about Jackie Robinson and his temper, well, I'll put it nicely. He said he wasn't getting up. and told the bus driver, you better stop messing with me, and messing ain't the word he used. So I wanted to mention some of the black units that served during World War II. The Montfort Point Marines, the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions, the Triple Nichols 555th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was a part of the 82nd Airborne Infantry, 761st Tank Battalion, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the 688 Central Postal Directory Battalion. Those were African American women who went overseas. They were commanded by Major Charity Adams, and they were tasked with getting the mail facility in order. When they got there, they thought it was going to be 6 months before they could get that stuff straight, because mail was just sitting over there. And their motto was no mail, no morale. And they understood the importance of getting the mail to the troops in the field. And it only took them 3 months to do it. They did it in 24-hour shifts, and it only took them 3 months to get that mail out. And so those ladies distinguished themselves. And of course, the Red Ball Express, which was, the pre-bombing to the Normandy invasion, destroyed a lot of the railways. And so a lot of the supplies, as the fronts started to move forward, had to be trucked in. And this was on a 24-hour thing. And so you had a lot of truck drivers who were driving, and 80% of them were African American. And we had the opportunity to meet one of them 2014, I think it was the 70th anniversary of D-Day, and he was kind of ashamed to say he was a truck driver, but when we found out he was Red Ball Express, we made an issue of Mr. Nathaniel Johnson. And so those are just some of the individuals and some of the groups that blacks served in. There were just under 2,000 African Americans at D-Day, on D-Day. And if you look at the film footage, I didn't find out until years later. I had no idea that was the case. And there was a 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, and those men were tasked with going on the beaches at the preliminary during the preliminary landings, and put up barrage balloons. It had these cables and explosives on it, and the reason you do that is to prevent enemy fighters from strafing your troops on the beaches. And so they had to put those balloons up in the middle of fire. And so that's what's going on with those guys. And William Simon from Washington, D.C., I met him when he was here. He was very instrumental in District of Columbia Public Schools. They just named a scholarship fund after him, but he was about 20 years old. I think he just had a birthday, and how did he celebrate? He was at Utah Beach at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I had the opportunity to interview him before he passed. During the Battle of the Bulge, they needed soldiers, and it was going to be blacks and whites fighting together. Imagine that. And but they wanted the blacks to rescind or give up their rank because they did not want blacks commanding white troops. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart, Tuskegee Airman Harry Stewart, said that when that took place, he was a little nervous because he thought they were going to pull some of them off the line to put them in the infantry, but that never happened. And so, of course, we have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, and many of us are familiar with the 332nd Fighter Group, which went overseas and ended up fighting out of Ramatelli, Italy. But there is another group of individuals, the 477th Bombardment Group, which was training to fly B-25 Mitchells. They were going to go into the Pacific. The war ended before they were deployed overseas, but their claim to fame is the Freeman Field incident. There was a colonel by the name of Colonel Selway, who was a Southerner, and he wanted to enforce segregation on the base. And so 61 of those guys tried to get into the officers club, and they were not allowed to go in, and so they were arrested for that. And later on, Colonel Selway came up with a document essentially wanting them to sign and say, hey, we will adhere to segregation, right? He tried to classify them as trainees or something like that, but they were officers, and by regulations they could have gone into the officers club. And 101 of those guys would not sign it. and they were taken off the base, taken away from Freeman, and arrested and held under guard, actually. But that's another tremendous story we don't talk much about. Tuskegee Airman Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson talks about, and he's very vocal about it. If you know Colonel, he doesn't pull any punches. He was talking about coming down the gangplank, and he said there was a white corporal with a sign that said color on this side, white on the other side. And Colonel Jefferson was like, look at this. Well, I won't tell you what he said, but if you know Colonel Jefferson, he's got some pretty flowery language. Let's leave it that way. So black veterans faced mistreatment, violence, and lynching when they returned. African American veterans resented being treated as second-class citizens after returning home and began to press for civil rights, including the ability to vote. Now, you imagine you're going overseas to fight for freedom and democracy. You better believe you're going to come home with that same type of thing. Look, why isn't this happening with me? And Colonel Stewart even talked about the fact that he had gone over and for the first time, he's afforded the everything an officer and gentleman would be afforded, and so that actually inspired him to do some other things. But many white supremacists resented them and wanted to reestablish dominance over them. The number of lynchings of black people rose. After the war, there were 12 individuals who were lynched in the Deep South in 1945 alone. 1947, a black Navy veteran named Joe Nathan Roberts, studying at Temple University through the GI Bill, was visiting family in Sardis, Georgia, when a group of white men became upset because he refused to call them sir. Later that night, the men abducted Mr. Roberts from his parents' home and shot him to death. September 9th, 1948, a group of white men shot and killed a 28-year-old black veteran named Isaiah Nixon outside of his home and in front of his wife and 6 children, just hours after he defied threats and voted in a local primary election in Montgomery County, Georgia. 2 white men were arrested and charged with his death, and they were later acquitted by all white juries. There were 7 African Americans, World War II veterans, who were awarded the Medal of Honor, but that did not come until 1997. So for some reason, no blacks had won the Medal of Honor during or shortly after World War II. They had some people who investigated what some of these individuals did, and they found that 7 of them did merit the Medal of Honor. And when they finally did this in 1997, Vernon Baker was the only one who was still alive to receive his medal. The other 6 were awarded posthumously. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the GI Bill, what it was supposed to do. And of course, the GI Bill, when World War I veterans came home, they couldn't get their old jobs back, and there was a lot of stuff that they were not able to do. So they didn't want that to happen again to World War II veterans when they came home. So the GI benefits for World War II veterans were as such. GI Bill gave World War II veterans many options and benefits. Those who wish to continue their education in college or vocation school could do so tuition free up to $500 while also receiving a cost of living stipend. As a result, almost 49% of college admissions in 1947 were veterans. The GI Bill opened the door of higher education to the working class in a way never before done. The bill provided a $20 weekly unemployment benefit for up to 1 year for veterans looking for work. Job counseling was also available. The government guaranteed loans for veterans who borrowed money to purchase a home, business, or farm. These were guaranteed loans. These loans enabled hordes of people to abandon city life and move to mass-produce cookie-cutter homes in the suburbs. This exodus from major cities would help shape America's socio-economic and political landscape for years to come. Medical care for veterans was also provided in the GI Bill. Additional hospitals were established for veterans, and the Veterans Administration took over all veteran-related concerns. So by 1956, almost 10 million veterans had received GI benefits. Now, let's look at how this played out with African American veterans. Although the GI Bill extended benefits to all veterans regardless of gender or race, it was easier for some people to collect than others. In many cases, benefits were administered by an all-white Veterans Administration at the state and local level. So you can imagine that could be somewhat difficult for individuals. African Americans and women struggled to receive higher education or loans. In some southern states, they were steered to menial jobs instead of college. Even if an African American received tuition money, their choices were slim since many colleges were segregated, especially in the southern states. African American veterans in the North fared somewhat better, but still did not receive a higher education in numbers anywhere near their white peers. College choices for women were also slim since men almost always received enrollment preference. And that's women of any color. The discrimination did not end with education, and what I'm about to say is crucial. Local banks in the South often refused to lend money to African Americans to buy a home, even with the government backing the loan. And many of America's new suburban neighborhoods prohibited African Americans from moving in. As a result, many African Americans remained in the cities as whites flocked to the suburbs. Now, Reverend Dr. Walter Fauntroy, who was pastored here in Washington, D.C. for years, was on Dr. King's D.C. staff. His brother, Robert Fauntroy, was a part of the 477 bombardment group, said that every citizen should have access to these 5 things: education, economics, health care, housing, and the democratic process, which is both judicial and political. Each of these affects the other 4, and in any 2 will affect each other differently. I had interns, we actually did an exercise on that one year to see how all of this plays. And so all of this stuff is related, and we talked about that earlier. That's why all of this that we're talking about is so important, particularly if you are going to build generational wealth for your children and your children's children. But let's close with the legacy of African Americans in World War II. What did it accomplish? What did it do? Well, World War II was a proving ground. It proved once and for all that blacks would fight for the country. And eventually they would fight and die in disproportionate numbers. If you go to they're building a wall for Korea, to put the names of Korea. During the Korean War, the black population was about 12%, and that's on the liberal side. 19% of the individuals who died in Korea were African American. Now, you may be saying, wow, that's disproportionate. By the time we get to Vietnam, with the population still at around 12%, 24% of the individuals who died, almost 1/4 of that Vietnam Veterans Wall contains the names of African Americans. So we see that blacks start to die in disproportionate numbers defending the country. When combined with black women who enlisted into the Women's Army Corps, more than 1 million African Americans served the military during the war. And at home, African Americans proactively fought for their right to work in positions in the defense industry, facing discrimination and segregation. There were riots at facilities, manufacturing facilities, because of that whole thing, and they were trying to Keep the blacks on one side and the whites on the other. Two things that came out as a result of blacks fighting in World War II: Executive Orders 9980 and 9981. 9980 was fair employment practices within the federal establishment. In 9981, pretty much most of us know what that is. That's the full integration of the military. And even though that was signed in 1948, it still took a while before all of the military units fell in line with that. Dr. Roscoe Brown, Tuskegee Airman. Now remember, Dr. Roscoe Brown, and he claims he's the first to shot down the ME-262 German jet, applied to go to fly for the airline industry, and he gave his application to a woman, and he left out and realized he had left his newspaper, and he went back in to get his newspaper, and he saw the woman putting his application into the trash. It was a hand in a cookie jar moment, and she told him, she says, look, we can't hire you because you are black. And Colonel Harry Stewart talked about the same thing. He said he had interviewed, and they said they couldn't hire him because he was black. He says because the passengers would lose faith in the airline, or confidence in the airline, if they saw you going to the cockpit. Of course, Brigadier General Charles McGee, he within the past 2 years was promoted to general. He still holds the record for combat flight hours or combat time, and today, even in his hunt, after older than 100 years old, and he is still out inspiring young kids to be all that they can be. Every black aviator in the cockpit, whether it's military or commercial, owes a debt of gratitude to the Tuskegee experience. And more opportunities to blacks, should I say, there are more opportunities for blacks in the military. Today, African Americans comprise almost 20% of the active duty Army and about 13% of the Army National Guard. And that's not even talking about the Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and the Navy. So, in conclusion, I know what you're sitting there thinking. You're like, so what? Why is this important? I'll tell you why this is important. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the founder of what we know today as African American History Month, said that if you do not see yourself in history, you will be relegated to a place of negligibility, and then you will be on the verge of extermination. And if young kids don't see themselves in history, they're not going to see the significance of who their ancestors were and what their ancestors did. And so that's something that we must always keep before the eyes of our students. Now, I coached football for 15 seasons, and 3 years I coached at Howard University. My head coach, Steve Wilson, who played in the NFL for 11 years, called his coaches together one morning. He asked us, what does it take to make a great team? And here's what he told us. He says it's the acquisition of talent. You're always looking for better players. Now, I'm just going to tell you that those better players right now are in elementary, middle, high school, and college. And we have to train them all up. We don't know what type of gifts are on the inside of these kids, and so we must train them all up, because we are responsible for what we do with these kids. And if we are serious about the team being great, right, then you got to have great players. Now, if you're not concerned about winning, if you're not trying to have a good team, then you don't have to do that. You can put whoever you want in those places. But we owe it to ourselves and for these kids to allow them to be as great as they can possibly be. Everyone must feel a part of the team if the team is going to get better. If you want them to have buy-in, they've got to see themselves. They have to feel like that they're making a contribution to it. And that's what we need to do, and that is the legacy of African Americans, part of the legacy of African Americans who fought in World War II.